Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving right into one of the most complex, paradoxical, and honestly urgent realities of our time, the intertwined forces of global development and ecological survival. Look, we live in this era of absolutely unprecedented wealth and technological advancement, yet somehow we're still surrounded by persistent, extreme poverty, all while our planet is flashing some pretty massive warning signs. So, we're going to connect the dots today between economics, innovation, and the hard limits of our natural world. Let's get into it.
$2.3 trillion. Just let that number sink in for a second. That is the staggering amount of foreign aid sent from the developed world to the global south since the end of World War II. It's a massive, massive transfer of wealth. And it's been fueled by good intentions, government programs, and everyday people who just genuinely want to make a difference.
But honestly, seeing a number like that forces us to ask a pretty uncomfortable question, right? Why hasn't this ended extreme poverty? Our belief in charity is incredibly valid and noble, but the failure rate of this top-down macroeconomic approach is just staggering. Despite trillions of dollars, trillions with a T, entire regions, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, remain trapped in this brutal cycle of destitution. So where did we go wrong, and more importantly, how do we actually fix it?
So here is our roadmap for today. We'll be looking at the limits of charity, market-creating innovations, the wealth and poverty paradox, the tragedy of the commons, and finally, a sustainable path forward. And as you'll see, these seemingly completely different topics are actually deeply, deeply connected.
All right, part one, the limits of charity.
For decades now, the go-to strategy for fighting poverty has been top-down, basically pushing resources into developing nations. But here's the catch. This often completely misses the actual localized needs of the extremely poor. And in a lot of cases, it accidentally crushes local businesses because, well, they simply can't compete with free goods handed out by foreign NGOs. A classic example of this push strategy is installing millions of toilets in poor parts of India to fight waterborne diseases. The intention, absolutely great, but without running water to actually flush them, well, it turns out plumbing is kind of a prerequisite, right? So they just end up abandoned. You simply can't force infrastructure onto a population. Now compare that to a pull strategy. Over in Nigeria, a company introduced Indomie instant noodles, which was just a cheap 20-cent meal. Now, noodles were not a staple there at the time, but that extreme affordability created a massive wave of organic demand. And that demand literally pulled in the necessary infrastructure. The company had to build its own warehouses, delivery trucks, and retail networks, which in turn created thousands of local jobs.
Another massive hurdle for charity is corruption, or let's call it what it really is, economic gangsterism. Let's compare two different approaches to fixing this. In Kenya, millions of dollars in aid meant for roads just vanished because of bribes. When researchers went in and asked locals if maybe raising police salaries would help, the answers they got were basically useless. Economists actually call this cheap talk. But over in Indonesia, economist Ben Olken ran a really clever randomized trial. He gave villages funding for roads, but he told one specific group that they would face an independent engineering audit later on. The result? No way. Just the mere threat of that audit reduced theft to less than 20%. The takeaway here is we absolutely have to rely on data and solid incentives, not just good intentions.
And look, when local economies completely fail, the fallout is absolutely devastating. In Tanzania, researchers found a really dark statistic. Murders of elderly women accused of witchcraft nearly double during severe drought years. Now, as horrifying as that is, researchers point out that it's actually a rational, albeit deeply tragic economic phenomenon. When crops fail and starvation literally sets in, elderly women who need care but don't get pensions suddenly become a massive financial burden on their desperate families. Extreme poverty and weather vagaries just push human behavior right to the absolute brink.
Moving right along to part two, market-creating innovations.
So if traditional top-down aid and charity have these really strict limits, what actually does work? Well, we need to completely shift our mindset. We have to stop viewing the developing world as a charity case and start seeing it as the absolute engine of future global prosperity. The key here is a concept called non-consumption. Now, this is the massive, totally untapped economic arena where no affordable, accessible fixes currently exist for people who would otherwise be consumers. The billions of people living on less than a few dollars a day, they aren't just statistics on a page. They are the world's largest, most dynamic, untapped market. If you can design a product with absolutely ruthless affordability that serves them, you don't just turn a profit, you actually build lasting societal wealth from the ground up.
Let me give you 3 quick micro-narratives to show you exactly what I mean. First up, Moe Ibrahim. Back in the 90s, all the experts told him that building a mobile network in Africa was completely foolish because the population was simply too poor. But Ibrahim targeted that exact non-consumption, created Celtel, and ended up building a billion-dollar industry that fundamentally revolutionized communication across the whole continent. Second, look at Galans in China. Also in the 90s, microwaves cost around $500. Galans basically ignored wealthy buyers, built an aggressively cheap microwave for the masses, and eventually captured half of the entire global market. And hey, this isn't just a developing world thing. Think about the Wright brothers. I mean, these guys were uneducated bicycle mechanics who achieved human flight through pure bootstrap innovation. They completely outperformed Samuel Langley, who had massive backing and heavy funding from the US government. The point is, innovation, not just throwing money at a problem, is what really drives progress.
Which brings us to part 3, the wealth and poverty paradox.
Okay, so if innovation creates all this wealth, why are we still seeing poverty persist right alongside it? To unpack this, we need to look back at the 19th century political economist Henry George. He spotted a massive systemic flaw in how wealth actually gets distributed. He called it monopoly rents. Basically, this is passive income that gets extracted from the community's progress simply because someone happens to hold property, land, or a patent. Think about it. If you own the land that a brand new railroad runs through, you didn't do the work to build that railroad, but you suddenly get to charge astronomically higher rent simply because the community around you innovated and progressed. You get the reward for their work.
Let's trace how this builds up, using the settlement of the American West as a perfect example. So back in the 1850s, land was super abundant out west, which meant labor wages were actually really high. But by the 1860s, the railroads arrived, and towns started booming. What did that lead to? Massive land speculation in the 1870s. By the time we hit the 1880s, landlords and speculators had driven rents up so incredibly high that they basically captured almost all the new wealth that the railroads generated. This forced the wages of everyday laborers right back down to mere subsistence levels. It shows us that monopoly rents inevitably breed extreme inequality. The community is the one creating the value, but the speculator is the one capturing it.
All right, part 4, the tragedy of the commons.
So what happens when this relentless human drive for economic growth smashes right into the physical limits of our planet? Well, we're basically on a collision course with nature right now, and it's being driven by some massive earth-changing trends. First, poorer countries are rapidly industrializing, which is great for them, but it requires an immense amount of energy. Second, the human population continues to surge toward 9 billion people. Third, urbanization is accelerating. People are packing into megacities faster than ever. And underlying all of this, climate change is just radically altering our global ecologies. We are quite simply asking the Earth to provide way more than it actually has to give.
Just consider the hidden footprint of our daily lives for a second. 800 gallons. That is the absolutely astounding amount of fresh water required to produce just one single hamburger. Between growing all the grain to feed the cattle and the water the cattle themselves consume, the resource cost is just off the charts. When you multiply that by billions of consumers globally adopting these really resource-heavy diets, you can quickly see why underground aquifers are literally running dry all over the world.
So why on earth do we let this happen? Well, bioethicist Garrett Hardin explains this beautifully using game theory and something called the tragedy of the commons. It goes like this. When a resource is shared by everyone, like the ocean or the atmosphere, self-interested individuals, who he calls cheaters, will often overexploit it for their own short-term personal gain. They get to keep 100% of the profit while the cost of their actions is shared by everybody else. This is exactly what happened to the North Atlantic cod fishery. Fishermen competed so ruthlessly against each other to catch the absolute most fish that they entirely collapsed the population, completely destroying their own livelihoods in the long run. Without penalties and really well-managed cooperation, human nature will just consume shared resources right down to the point of total devastation.
And finally, part 5, a sustainable path forward.
Now look, if you're feeling a little doom and gloom fatigue right now, I completely get it. But hang on, because this next part should offer some immense hope. Economist Jeffrey Sachs actually sat down and calculated exactly what it would cost the developed world to address climate change, preserve global biodiversity, and finally end the extreme poverty trap. The total? Just 2.4% of the rich world's gross national product. That means 97.6% of the rich world's wealth remains totally untouched. We have more than enough capital right now to stabilize our planet. What we're actually missing is the focused will to allocate it effectively.
And what about the really crucial issue of stabilizing that surging global population? Well, it turns out we actually don't need any draconian measures to fix it. The data clearly shows that population growth naturally and organically slows down when we just take these 4 proven steps. Ensure schooling for girls,
provide reproductive health services, establish real legal protections and economic opportunities for women, and drastically lower our infant mortality rates. Because when parents know for sure that their children will survive, and when women are empowered and educated, family sizes naturally start to decrease. And that naturally eases the incredible strain on our planet's resources.
Wow, we've covered an immense amount of ground today. Everything from the pitfalls of traditional charity and the absolute genius of bottom-up innovation, all the way to the dangers of monopoly wealth and the incredibly fragile limits of our shared Earth. But I want to leave you with an African proverb that I think hits the nail on the head. The best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago. The second best time is now. The challenges of global poverty and ecological collapse are heavily driven by momentum. Obviously, we can't undo the past 20 years of resource depletion or misguided aid programs, but the thing is, we have the tools, we have the market innovations, and we have the actual data today. So the question really isn't whether we can afford to fix the paradox of progress. The real question is, can we possibly afford the ultimate cost of doing nothing? Thanks so much for watching this explainer, and keep learning.